A man sent to broker a real estate deal with a foreign stranger soon finds out that he's getting more than he bargained for. That's basically the story of Nosferatu. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there.
And yeah, I think, I don't know about you, I think we talked offline about the fascination with the vampire story. And I think for me, like as a kid, that was like, besides zombies, vampires probably one of the, horror stories or monsters that like I've had a fascination growing up with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a really interesting concept in general. Something that is, immortal. So there's all these themes of what's it like to actually live forever. They're hugely powerful, strong. They have these abilities to coerce women, but don't want sex from them, and men too. It's kind of, there's a sort of, it's like a sort of dangerous, sort of animalistic, sort of sexual nature the vampires sort of represent.
Yeah.
But it's often beneath this sort of sheen of elegance and often sort of elitism as well. That's the other sort of general theme that ties them all together. So yeah,
it's definitely spawned like kind of series like Twilight, like True Blood was another one that kind of had some what you talked about, that there's this kind of charisma slash like you said, sense of elitism and kind of like being in this kind of like not so much a coven but like this I guess brother sisterhood and stuff like that. Ironically, of course, with Nosferatu, as we'll get into, it's not quite the opposite, but almost like quite a departure from it, because instead of like kind of bats and kind of the mystery and power of that and stuff like that, we have this kind of theme of rats and pestilence and stuff. So it's almost like an anti, like certainly like generally speaking, we don't think of especially during recent times, we don't think of plagues as like kind of particularly charming or charismatic.
No, it's a very different sort of take on it in that respect. And I mean, so this is the 1922 version, a silent movie, black and white, of course. And I mean, this, one of the most interesting things is this idea that Nosferatu, or Count Orloc, as he's also known as in this movie, has to sleep in a coffin filled with soil from the Black Death. And hence why there's these rats that sort of get spread with his with him as well as when he travels. I mean, so 1922, I mean, I guess we're post World War One, and in Germany, because this is a German movie, and we have hyperinflation, things like this, economic collapse in Germany whilst this is sort of being made, and then all of a sudden looking for a scapegoat.
Sounds like a setup for something.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? And is it any wonder that you're going to a different country and you're inviting these people into your country, and they're spreading a plague along with them, spreading disease and pestilence wherever they go. So there's a very much a kind of fear of others, probably anti-Semitic sort of undertone, I would say, in the 1922 movie.
And that's the ironic part about it too, because it doesn't seem like it was a conscious thing, like Murnau, the director, he had actors who were Jewish. I believe the writer was even Jewish, kind of for the screenplay and stuff like that. So, like as far as I read some articles about it. As far as I could tell, there was nothing kind of anti-Semitic about at least its intention. But meanwhile, like you said, with all these different things, right? Like even like kind of the caricature of this Nosferatu that's very charismatic and stuff. He's got the, kind of pointy teeth, and he's kind of like, with the long nails, and then meanwhile he's kind of, got the ears. It's just kind of like very much like these stereotypical caricatures of the Jewish people in that time period. The Nazis kind of just jumped all over. But ironically, they didn't even use this movie as a political device, anything. Although Hitler does in Mein Kampf, refer to Jews as vampires, bloodsuckers, and parasites, that,
Yeah.
race which shuns the sunlight. It's like kind of,
Wow.
it's a weird coincidence.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to make, draw those conclusions.
Mhm.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's in terms of the glam, normally we think of, Bram Stoker's Dracula, it's kind of the sophisticated sort of elite I mean, I suppose it's similar in this, in that he's a Count Orloc, he's living in a castle. But in this one, it's in a ruined castle, and it's looking a bit shabby, to be honest.
Yeah.
But there is this sort of thing of a foreign elite coming in and somehow corrupting and spreading pestilence among your people. So there's a bit of us versus them. Yeah, absolutely. Preying on women, totally. Yeah. So it's
all the fears of the German people and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like kind of embodied, like kind of in the vampire stuff. And then in this kind of the myth that the Nazis used was like kind of the myth of like kind of, like just almost like the same things that happened in the US with like, kind of the blacks kind of, coming after our women and stuff like that. It's like kind of just one of those fears that like is used to kind of stoke and the fires of prejudice, and then ultimately just what became the Holocaust and stuff.
Yeah. So bit of a sidebar this, but one thing I noticed when I was watching this was that it kept reminding me of another one of our favorite movies, Star Wars.
Oh, funny.
Because if you look at just from a sort of visual thing of the outfits, you can't help thinking Princess Leia looks a bit like the stalked sort of woman in Nosferatu. And actually, when you compare, the force power, it's kind of telekinesis, which is what we see with Nosferatu. He can influence the minds of people at a distance, which is pretty much what he does to, the wife on the other side of the shore. And Dracula tends to wear a cape and things like this, and it started made me think, oh yeah, there's almost like a kind of, I wonder if George Lucas actually started with Darth Vader as a kind of a robotic Dracula and pursuing Princess Leia, and kind of built the world out around from that.
Right.
Because there was, I mean, I think it was even the hair or something. Princess Leia almost looks like a Germanic kind of expressionist, a scream queen in a way.
Right, with the buns, the classic buns and stuff. Kind of, it's very much like how like the German women, wore their hair at different times and stuff.
Exactly.
And more so than like kind of like different times. At some point, we'll talk about the reference to Hidden Fortress and stuff. It definitely looks a lot more German than Japanese.
Yeah. And of course, people often make that similarity, they make that comparison with, the Empire in Star Wars is like the Nazis in Germany,
right.
So it's, funny sort of weird connection there. So,
well,
the other thing that I really found interesting in this, mainly because we always criticize how bad the dialogue and the writing is in a lot of these remakes,
right.
But it's interesting to watch a silent movie and watch an actual a proper feature length movie that is, because this was 1 hour 20, which is a long movie for the 1920s.
That time period,
and their decisions on how to actually tell the story visually, because it's a pure visual medium, and so obviously dialogue is very minimal, and it's Nosferatu is probably about the closest thing that we can say to a modern horror / action movie, but 100 years ago. So it was really interesting to see how they used the actors in various things, and it tended to be, the dialogue would be a very simple line of, hey, I'm just going up to Count Orloc's castle, and then it would cut to the visual part of the storytelling would be all the expressions of the people in the bar and their reactions to it and everything else. Or it would be them. There would be long shots of them sort of like traveling through the mountains, the Carpathian Mountains of Transylvania, or Count Orloc using his telekinetic powers to do stuff. So it was just, we often criticize things for this, telling and not showing. And it's interesting to see how, when you're forced to make a movie that way, how you go about it. And I think maybe that's actually almost a good way of coming up with an initial script, is kind of thinking, okay, if this was a silent movie, how would I do this? And then add the dialogue later.
And I feel like the acting is kind of like very pantomime. It's a lot more like what you would see from theater and stuff. And apparently, like the first, black and white, stars, a lot of them were directly, came from theater training and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean it's very expressive because it's you've got to tell this everything, your emotions and everything else visually. So
it's got to be kind of like
over the top.
Yeah.
And also it explains it. When I was watching, I realized, that particular period between the 20s and I guess the mid 30s, the women have incredibly dark and thick eyeliner. It's always characterized by very pale faces and really thick black kind of eyeliner. And I realized, the reason for that is because you've got to make the eyes clear so that you can actually see what the expression is and the emoting, that people can tell, because we're quite a long way away from HD here. You've really got to try and highlight that as part of the storytelling. Hence why I think they went in that direction, makeup wise and stuff.
The thing that I think we should mention at this point also, like Max Schreck is the what's called Count Orloc and stuff, and and that's the thing I haven't had a chance to see was the interview with the or not interview, but the Shadow of Vampire, which is apparently based on this kind of like this fictionalized story or idea that like he actually was Shrek was a vampire or something like that, and then Count Orloc, the reason why apparently that they used that name instead of Dracula was that this is actually a illegal copy. In fact, the first copies of the movie were destroyed and stuff. And in fact, there's only a few kind of it's probably one of those things that like if you ever like kind of somehow in the garage still find one and stuff, an actual original copy, jump on and stuff. But a lot of the originals were destroyed because of the rights issue with the Bram Stoker what's called estate and stuff like that. And another thing I really sort of talking about estates and rights, and it's odd that this becomes a real estate deal in Nosferatu. In the the original Bram Stoker, he just goes to his castle and that's kind of where everything takes place. This is why I think it's definitely to do with sort of immigrants, because it's this idea of you're making a deal with the devil and they're moving in next door to you, and they're going to sort of that's why I think that has to be the link for the immigration in Nosferatu. I think also as well the other interesting sort of subtext of this is that and it's more highlighted in the remake, I would say, than this, but Renfield is kind of an interesting character as this person who's already been corrupted but is now essentially mad. The influence of these foreigners is to drive your people mad, essentially, and lose their sort of logical reasoning, I guess would be one way of sort of saying that. So there's a few. I mean, I guess that character is kind of in Dracula as well, but he's kind of just his manservant in the castle. He's not really a separate person. So there definitely is a connection too with like this idea of, like you said, foreigners being associated with like kind of like corruption and also like plague and stuff like that. I believe like kind of that this goes deeper because of the fact that like like I was reading like kind of some of these historical references about never mind the more recent the Spanish flu and stuff, and then of course we have with coronavirus and COVID and stuff like that, this idea that it's a disease coming from China now and stuff like that, and that led to the fears of like what our esteemed ex-president, thank God, called Kung flu, and it just kind of lends to this idea of prejudice and this idea that like foreigners are just are going to bring nothing but kind of problems and disease, and the more historical kind of connection though is the fact that like what happened was after the Crusades that there was more trade and everything like that. You had like kind of these Jewish merchants that were kind of going from city to city, and so when you go from place to place, one of the things you pick up is unfortunately diseases, and so there's this association then like kind of back then it was like the Black Death and everything like that. And again, and rats was the connection with plague and everything like that. Yeah. That you have like just that triad, if you will, of like, foreigners equals rats and equals disease.
Yeah. It's funny, you never think about that in terms of the reasons for any kind of prejudice against any nomadic sort of people. But yeah, it's a very obvious connection, isn't it, really, in today's world?
And we already, as we talked about different times on other episodes, this is natural fear of like us versus them, like that's of course, like a very primal thing. So add to it, like it's fueled by like kind of this actual disease that on top of everything else and stuff, and boom.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess unless you have any more insights, maybe this is time to move on to our good friend Werner Herzog's.
Just one last.
Go for it then. Yeah.
Just one last thing. In March in 2020, so like just last year, the New York office of the FBI issued an alert, like that white supremacist groups were trying to spread COVID among the Jews, so that the Jews would be blamed for infecting the general population. So here we go, full circle. That years later, right? I mean, we're supposedly this democratic country, with this embracing of it, kind of immigrants, kind of who make up this country and stuff like that. Again, like, I mean, we're in the 21st century, and meanwhile, here we go and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's our viewers may not know, but I contracted COVID not long ago and had to spend a little time in quarantine, and in doing so, I watched an awful lot of stuff about ancient cultures and conspiracy theories and all sorts of other things like this. I went right down the rabbit hole. And, according to the ancient people in their calendar of things, we're in the time of ignorance right now. So the fact that we're still sort of, being anti-Semitic 100 years on from 1922 almost is
right.
Half of the course, I guess, even with all the technology and everything else. So it's one of those sort of things that... and then this actually ties into the 79 version. We've completely sort of eschewed any spirituality or the ideas of anything that's beyond the physical body, and we're kind of rational materialists these days. But I mean, in the age of being more spiritual, we had the Renaissance and Michelangelo and Leonardo. And I mean, these days we have, I don't know, like Justin Bieber and OnlyFans. I mean, I'm not sure we're really going down the right path here, but
that is a right ironic connection though, of like spirituality and art and stuff, and then like kind of do we end up creating more crap than like during our less enlightened times and stuff.
Yeah
just lots of remakes too, right?
I know, right? Yeah, probably has a knock-on effect.
That's maybe like the sign of our decline of civilizations, like the more remakes that we end up doing versus original content and stuff.
I think for me, OnlyFans just seems like we're basically turning a generation of people into sex workers as a side hustle. That's like, surely this is not a good sign for civilization. I suppose it depends. Maybe I'm just too backwards thinking. It's all liberated, isn't it? There we go. More power to them. So yeah, I guess 1979, Werner Herzog with his very slow burn but quirky take on Dracula.
Yeah, and that's the funny part is now his. I watched an interview with him, so he goes back to calling it Count Dracula because now, like basically, like they said that they were coming after him again. He was like, okay, so you're coming after me for making a remake of an illegal kind of remake and stuff like that, and go ahead, try. They basically backed off at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, it's obviously we got as you said, the original sort of character names and things. So you've got Jonathan Harker this time, and his Count Dracula and things like this. And it's a very kind of just stylistically, it's got a much more dreamlike quality to the whole thing. And there's even dialogue where he's kind of describing it as, I wasn't even sure if I was really traveling to somewhere else. It all just seemed like a sort of a dream. And there's this, it has, obviously, he's a very low budget filmmaker who does a lot with that budget, though. I mean, I think he's one of the most, effective and economical kind of filmmakers in that respect. So there's a lot of quite intense handheld cameras. So, there's the scene where Dracula's sort of first meeting Harker, and he's cut his hand, and he goes in to sort of just randomly try and suck his hand in an event. And there's all this kind of real kind of intense claustrophobic kind of handy cam as he's sort of, slowly, encroaching on Jonathan Harker. So we should say, of course, Klaus Kinski, one of Werner Herzog's favorite actors, is in this.
Yep.
Famous for being incredibly emotional and erratic on set and causing productions to get to just chaos and things. So he's very good and kind of intense and creepy, I would say, as Count Dracula in this. But in a what I do think is quite clever about his performance in this is that he really evokes this sense of sympathy and desperation. He's sort of like you get this sort of sense that he's a sort of a desperate loner,
right,
who's also kind of quite depressed about sort of being immortal and not really having any other sort of happiness or love in his life or anything else like this. So he sort of becomes quite a sort of a tragic figure in a way that you're quite sympathetic to, I think, in this.
It's a little bit like how Memoirs of an Invisible Man like kind of pointed out, like, well, it's maybe not so great to be invisible and stuff. Here we have like kind of Count Dracula saying, well, actually, eternal life is really not such a great thing and stuff.
I think as well as interesting, Jonathan Harker's character is quite different from the original. In the original, they kind of portray him as when it's almost like an adventure. When he's told about he's got to go and see a count and get this real estate deal, he's all there sort of like laughing and smiles, hiking through the German countryside on his way to go and meet this exciting count, only to realize that it's probably not quite so fun after all. In this one, Harker is much more grounded and is much more sort of dutiful, and there's much more emphasis placed on his wife just being very worried about the implications of what's going to happen.
And that's like also like this classic horror trope of like, so his wife warns him, the innkeeper warns him, the gypsies warn him not to go. Even this book like kind of that they give him says, don't go and stuff. But of course, he has to go.
There seems to be a lot more emphasis, I would say, on his wife in this.
Definitely.
It's a good performance. I can't remember the actress's name, unfortunately, but
Isabelle Adjani, and actually she kind of like really makes a name for herself in the future. Like kind of passes in I mean quite a few like kind of award-winning movies. Like what's called she becomes leading actress in but a lot of foreign films and stuff. And so this movie definitely has a very art house kind of feel to it and stuff. And so I think it kind of at least for her like kind of really kind of helped her career along and stuff, which is like kind of not too common for these kind of the horror films for that matter and stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess just generally the style. I mean, his castle seems more like a very kind of claustrophobic, weird sort of villa, with just all this stone, everything made out of sort of stone. The whole thing is very sort of strange. There's a weird sort of boy playing the violin at Dracula's castle every morning, which is odd. And of course, we start with all of these, and it's kind of a bit like it. I think kind of sets the horror tone a little high because it doesn't ever deliver in it. But the opening scene with all these mummified remains of children to this kind of strange sort of haunting choral music.
And they're actually the mummified bodies of victims from the 1833 cholera epidemic in Mexico and stuff. So that's a kind of that's a funny connection, right, to the whole disease thing and stuff.
And
apparently Werner Herzog like kind of made it a point to kind of to get like kind of that. And like you said, it has very little, if any, connection to the story, other than the kind of more symbolic and the visual kind of reference and stuff. I would also say that
the whole tone of it. This felt much more, it's kind of creepy almost. It reminded me of a lot of the sort of subtle Japanese horror movies that we've watched, where
Yes.
a lot of the time the person that's kind of in peril is frozen by fear rather than running away from fear. You know, the feeling is that someone who's under Nosferatu's power in this is kind of powerless, and they're kind of frozen, and then he just sort of goes and bites them. And what's interesting for me was when Harker first happens to him, you know, Nosferatu comes into his room and he can't do anything. He's completely frozen. Whereas Lucy, the wife, is kind of almost experiencing and expressing his fear, but on the other side of in another country, essentially. So when he bites him, even though he's powerless, she wakes up and screams.
Right.
Which is this kind of interesting, weird thing of, again, a kind of a weird
psychic kind of connection,
but with the expression coming through her rather than him. So that was kind of interesting.
Should we spoil it that in this case there's not a happy ending?
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought that was another interesting idea, because I mean, this is the mythos of this particular variant of a vampire, in that he can only be, or one of the ways to kill him is to basically keep him distracted until sunrise. And then he's like, oh, I don't realize it's sunlight, and then gets killed by that. So it's a bit weird, but
and it's got to be a guy by
a virginal
or virtuous woman.
Virtuous, yeah. They don't actually say sort of virginal.
Right.
Yeah, it's along that line. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting in that. Yeah, obviously this is a very sort of traditional thing, and then in the 22 version, and that basically it's a woman's sort of chastity from these sort of immigrants who might sort of come in and basically corrupt your women. As just stay faithful to your husband, don't run away with an immigrant, and then we can banish the evil, is kind of, I guess, the undertone. This one is slightly different. I mean, I think what's interesting about it, he picked up on this idea that really the woman is the person that has the power in this situation, and that gets kind of transmuted in the Werner Herzog one into that she actually becomes the agent, you know, the person with agency to actually get rid of Nosferatu, which was an interesting change.
Yeah, it moves her to being the hero, actually. You know, like kind of, she starts off being kind of like, you know, the worried, you know, wife and stuff like that. But then ultimately she, you know, like kind of, you know, is the one that kind of realizes what's going on, that, you know, like kind of, you know, she's kind of takes the book seriously, that, you know, has this, you know, like you said, the recipe for, you know, destroying this vampire stuff. Even Van Helsing in this case, excuse me, and as we'll, you know, get when you get to the Dracula, you know, kind of mythology and stuff like that, or what's kind of normally canon, is normally the one that kind of is kind of the one who's questioning science versus faith and stuff like that, but ultimately decides that, like, but, you know, regardless of what is actually the case, you know, we've got to drive our heart through this, you know, bloodsucker's, you know, heart and stuff like that, and, you know, to get rid of him and everything. But in this case, it's actually Lucy who, you know, kind of has a revelation that, like, okay, you know, people are dying, and it's because of this, you know, vampire. Something's got to be done, you know, and she's the one to do it.
Yeah, well, the reason for that, I think, and I, you know, this version is not about immigration at all. And for me, this one is more about this, as I sort of hinted at earlier, is this idea of sort of materialism and rationalism versus spirituality. Because if you notice, like, no one, even including Van Helsing, who's the doctor academic in this, won't believe that there's any ties between the plague that is destroying the town and the people being killed with anything supernatural. You know, he's there arguing that, you know, we're in a rational time, this is obviously just a disease, you know, there's no connection. And it's her sort of intuition about her husband and about Nosferatu that makes us say, okay, this is something that's not obeying the normal rules of rational science. I'm going to have to work outside of those in order to beat him. And the other, I mean, I think the other sort of subtext here is, if you notice, the effect of Nosferatu in Werner Herzog's version is that he basically turns men mad, because Renfield is a lunatic. By the time Harker comes back, he doesn't recognize his wife, and he's starting to sort of like go mad. And the people in the town, if you notice, one of the big differences in this is you have this dance of death towards the end.
Right.
All the people have just kind of become nihilistic about this plague, and sort of drinking and dancing in the town center while the rats scurry around them, because they're like, hey, we're going to die.
Lots of rats.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of this thing of, well, you know, this is just the chaos of the universe. There's no sort of divine or other sort of guiding thing here that we can use to fight this evil. So we may as well just give up and give into it all, which I think is this kind of, again, it's sort of mirroring this scientific materialist outlook on the universe, that there is no kind of direction in particular. This is all just sort of random chaos, and so you just got to drink your way through it, essentially.
Right.
So yeah, that was kind of what I got out of it. And in this way, it's more the fact that she's realized that everyone in the town is never going to accept that there is something supernatural there, and she has to go and confront it herself, and try and sort of beat it. But in this case, really kind of submitting to it in a way, which was kind of odd. But we can get more into that. But that was what I got from it, because I mean, in the 70s, you know, I think there was a lot more, you know, people like Rupert Sheldrake and various other people talking about connections back to something that may have been lost, things like this. There was some of that stuff going around then. So I think, you know,
I feel like in some ways, whether subconscious or not, he almost was like kind of, you know, like kind of leading to a foretelling, or like kind of a glimpse into the materialism of the 80s. You know, like kind of, this was made in, you know, like you said, you know, 79. And so around the corner, we had the excess and the, you know, just a, you know, like kind of party till it's 1999, you know, attitude stuff, which of course leads to, ironically, a plague called AIDS. And also, like kind of, you know, just very, very much like kind of, you know, the drugs and you know, kind of like, you know, very much the, you know, the 80s version of kind of nihilism and you know, just basically, you know, materialism stuff. The striking scene for me visually was these, you know, boxes of, you know, kind of the coffins of the people going into the town square and stuff. And meanwhile, there's these piles of like people's stuff, you know, kind of just stuff that kind of just, you know, really, you know, just becomes worthless and stuff, you know, like, whereas they probably paid a fortune for it, you know, accumulating and stuff. But now, like, kind of, you know, it's just kindling for these fires and stuff like that. And I think a lot of ways it symbolizes kind of what we'll see with kind of, you know, besides like kind of, you know, the bodies of the AIDS victims and stuff, but also, you know, I feel like there's this premonition of like kind of, you know, like these scenes where you see, you know, like kind of with Escobar and stuff like that, these drug lords, that they're burning piles of cash, and, you know, like kind of like there's no tomorrow and stuff like that, because, you know, like even money at that point is this material that becomes worthless when, you know, like kind of just, you know, it's just kind of this excess and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then in the face of this kind of other plague, yeah, absolutely, you're right. I think it does sort of echo some of the future excesses we will see in the 80s. Yeah. I think the other interesting thing for me was that, you know, there's this really kind of striking scene is when Klaus Kinski's finally been sort of killed by her, and he's curled up on the floor, perfectly still,
right?
Like a kind of a bug or something like that. That's kind of, I mean, there's an incredible way of acting in that he's just there frozen whilst they're doing the entire scene around him.
Right.
That was, but this kind of this whole sort of way they use Nosferatu and as his character, and this is like someone who sort of unleashes this madness in men and sort of animalism, but sort of, you know, he's again, there's this weird sort of I don't know, sexual kind of connection in that she has to, you know, she basically tries to protect her husband with the consecration, and then consecrates all the coffins, and then basically lays herself out on the bed and says, sort of, come and get me, and then tells him to sort of keep coming for more until the sunlight, essentially. But it's sort of, but it's like there's this sort of, I don't know, a message of, you have to kind of submit in a way to this, to your fate. It's a sacrificial kind of death, really.
And that's what's funny about that is that it's closer to you know, like what the excuse me, there, you know, something that we talked about offline was that, like, there's an AMC version called Nosferatu, spelled with a 4, and that actually is very different from like this whole mythology, stuff like that. And even this, like, kind of is different from the very kind of typical, you know, Dracula mythos, because the fact that normally, you know, sunlight would kind of like make the vampires burn, and, you know, like kind of, you know, that kind of thing stuff. But it's not, and it's actually closer to what Guillermo Del Toro does with The Strain, which is a series that, like, they kind of make the disease like a literal plague or something like that, because the opening sequence that is like this, something happens on this flight that lands, and all the passengers are wiped out, and it's this disease that kind of, you know, like kind of gets them and stuff like that. And you know, but of course before that they kind of go mad in some ways and everything. And so you know, the rest of the series kind of gets into this, you know, mythology, and then that they also call him the master. So so they kind of, like, he definitely based things a lot more on the Nosferatu, you know, mythology that, you know, we see here and stuff like that, than the stuff that becomes more typical that we'll see when we get, you know, start talking about Dracula and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why I think the impact of Nosferatu is quite interesting, because it has this kind of disease element. It does almost seem like you have almost like the master and his disciples, and the more sort of elitist and sexual sort of thing of Dracula, and then you have the kind of plague style vampires, which is kind of, I think, where, you know, Nosferatu you can trace it back to that, perhaps.
And the one of the heroes from this strain is this rat catcher from New York and stuff like that. So yeah, and so that's another funny connection that I didn't realize until just talking about it now and stuff.
Yeah, another thing I realized when you were talking about the town square scene, where they're pulling out all these, you know, they're burning people's bodies with all their stuff and everything else. The other thing with the dance of death is that you kind of see livestock just randomly running around. Right. You know, there's no one really to care for them. There's pigs and sort of all sorts of things just randomly running around. And that kind of reminded me a little bit of I Am Legend, where you've got the city that's overrun with animals because no one's sort of left. So
interesting,
because I didn't think that was in the book. So whoever made that movie must have kind of picked it out from Werner Herzog's version or something.
Another reference,
something else. But I think in terms of on another animal note, it's interesting the way, for me, that they kind of keep cutting to a very sort of weird abstract shot of a bat flying. Right. So whenever it's kind of, they never really show his transformation into a bat, but it's almost like this representation of he's sort of floating around, and then it just cuts to him being there. Or it's sort of like there's a strange, again, with that final sequence where she keeps pulling him back in to keep sort of feeding on her. It's almost like he sort of looks away like, and pictures himself as the bat, but then doesn't. It's almost like, I should probably be going, but I can't, because I'm too enraptured with this woman that I'm feeding on, essentially. The other interesting thing I just realized about Van Helsing, again, going back to this whole sort of materialism, spiritual sort of juxtaposition we'll say in this, is that you notice Van Helsing is very much against Dracula being real. And then when he does finally find Klaus Kinski but curled up in a ball, and he realizes this is real, he then stakes Dracula, and of course he's then blamed by the townsfolk for being a murderer. So it's almost like by accepting the supernatural, he's lost all his credibility as an academic and a professional, which I thought was a really interesting thing. But also there's this question of the other thing that's slightly different in this one, and again we're spoiling it away here, is that the husband effectively becomes Nosferatu at the end, which again is this kind of I guess this sort of thing of I don't know what the message there really is. It's like, every man can potentially become a sort of animalistic thing, just feeding off women, and if they're not careful, or if he's influenced by other men, or what the deal there is. But it was an interesting direction for the movie to turn there.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's not the again, like it's yet another thing that's kind of very a departure from the things we see a lot in the Dracula canon and stuff. We're like, there's this happy ending and that we destroyed the vampire stuff. This is far from it, and having the hero ultimately succumb and become a vampire himself is like probably like the worst horrible thing that we can imagine. And in some ways though, at the same time, it is more typical of a horror movie where that like there's this kind of like dun dun dun, that like, will there be like a sequel then in some ways and stuff.
Yeah, you kind of get the impression he's not doing it for the sake of being a sequel in this. I think he's more just sort of definitely saying, oh well, this could be, perhaps any man is capable, perhaps. It is interesting in that respect of it's got a sort of slightly more poetic interpretation. I mean, one of the things I always thought was really interesting about this is the length of time that it spends doing aerial shots of ships to haunting sort of choral music. There's lots of sort of ideas of ships from aerial perspectives, this sort of derelict death ship kind of sailing into the canal and hitting the side of the harbor. There's a lot of ship-based shots in this, but it kind of makes me think, is there some sort of other message here? And
apparently like quite a bit of it was like an intentional reference to with the music was like kind of using Wagner, that is a reference then to what ultimately happened after the original Nosferatu, because what apparently Werner Herzog's kind of pointing to is the fact that like whether intentional or not, ultimately there was some kind of Nazi kind of connections that were made and stuff like that, and then Wagner was actually one of the things that was like kind of used by the Nazis as kind of saying here's this kind of Aryan spirit and stuff like that. And ironically again, Wagner himself though was actually very much not, he was very anti-Nazi and stuff like that. So it's this kind of weird kind of reference that on one hand saying that like there was this kind of thing that happened with the Nazis that kind of like pointed to the Jewish kind of connection with vampires and stuff like that. But meanwhile, I kind of like the original Nosferatu and Wagner. They the artists themselves were not for the Nazis. The artists themselves were not promoting like kind of so it was this. It's almost like this weird, very meta kind of way of doing this reference right to something that like happened ultimately and stuff like that with the art, and then that like we're Herzog saying this thing happened, but like the artist had nothing to do with it and stuff.
I mean, I would say as well, one of the most effective uses of music in the movie is again that the town square where everyone's sort of essentially going mad. What we didn't mention about that is that basically there's no audio. And this is a weird sort of throwback to almost like its roots of a silent movie, because all you're actually hearing is this sort of soft choral music that's supposed to be from the perspective of Lucy's head. And she's this sort of the only one seeing what's really happening as she walks through this square. while all this chaos has ensued, and there's it's a very effective way of making her feel completely separate from the chaos that's around her. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it definitely has a very haunting kind of mood because of that.
Yeah. So let me ask you, I mean, what did you think of like Harker becoming Nosferatu at the end? What was your kind of...
I was caught off guard by that, and I was like kind of I was really surprised that that's what would happen, because again, like normally when you kill the vampire, like kind of the story goes that like, oh, we have a happy ending and stuff. So it's like kind of like, oh man, that's a bumper, stuff like that.
It's a bit like a video game, isn't it? You kill the boss vampire and you're like, it's all good, or the other ones die too.
Right.
So yeah, totally. That's Lost Boys rules, but not in this one. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say this is necessarily a scary movie per se. I don't really feel scared, but it's kind of a little creepy, but more interesting, I think, than anything else. And just sort of, it's one of those movies that's quite slow, but there's a lot of stuff that you kind of feel like he just got his camera out and started filming things randomly and just caught them at interesting points in time, like. I'm just going to throw in a random kid playing a violin badly at dawn, and this will be something compelling to watch. So yeah, I mean, so what was your thoughts versus the original or the remake on this one?
I feel like this is one of those kind of cases that like the remake actually like elevates the source materials like that, and because it's its own thing, and I feel like that's like kind of more telling of the director. I actually don't, like, you actually probably know a lot more about Werner Herzog than I do, and I definitely had a lot more respect for his work just watching this and stuff like that. And then I look forward to any other kind of things that I may kind of ultimately watch of his.
Yeah, I should point out, I watched his masterclass, which was very interesting actually. He had a lot of he was a very economical filmmaker and always brought his movies in on budget, but always I tried to find what I gather compelling things that were just happening around him, and that if it was on location or various other things. There's often sort of times where the film will seem quite random in that it's kind of just filming something and almost in the background and stuff like that. It's a bit sort of David Lynchy and things like this at times. But he did say that he enjoyed hiring Klaus Kinski just because he was such an over-the-top person, and the type of conflict that he would introduce into the other actors he thought was good for the production. He actually, he liked that sort of element of method acting and method conflict, I guess, was some of the things. And I mean, I think he said with Algera, which is the one where they try and it's sort of like about a mad conquistador taking a boat through the Amazon or something like this, and everyone basically goes mad and dies and things like this. It's kind of like, again, he tried to sort of foster that same environment with most of the production, in that everyone's feeling fairly desperate and mad by the end of it. But I mean, we talked about that with Stanley Kubrick and The Shining. It's that's how you get your realism on screen, I guess. And I think there's the scene where Klaus Kinski is sort of lunging towards Jonathan Harker's character. He looks genuinely sort of taken aback by what Klaus Kinski's doing, and it's pretty compelling to watch.
Yeah, they do say that in acting, like some of the best best things you can film is reacting versus acting and stuff.
Yeah, but then there's sort of the other side of it where there was the first Suicide Squad movie where I think Jared Leto was sending sort of like dog turds and things like this to his other cast members.
A little too much.
And it's kind of like, this isn't just being a bit of an asshole, really, rather than being a method actor.
That's not method acting.
Yeah.
Maybe in your book it is, but
yeah, strange though. But yeah, quite like Jared Leto, who I, of course, will be Morbius coming up with Marvel's version of vampire anti-hero fairly soon. So yeah, But yeah, definitely for me, yeah, is it better than the original? It's very hard to say. It's also almost impossible to compare them because they're so different. I mean, I guess you've got to say the original is better because I suppose it's a cinema classic. But yeah, definitely, I think Werner Herzog's remake justifies itself as an interesting project that stands up and is, if not as good, definitely a very interesting and watchable movie, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like it's made with like kind of really, here we have a black and white classic and stuff and all things to kind of go with it. But now he has the opportunity to have not only sound and stuff but also color, and like these actors and stuff like that, to bring more to the performance. And he really takes advantage of that. He's like using things that's available. And like you said, I could definitely see that here's a director who like makes the most of his budget. I mean, like clearly he's like kind of pushing things to the maximum.
Yeah. So I guess, well, we're in a kind of a vampire monster tip at the moment, aren't we? So I guess we will be doing more vampire movies coming up. I guess what is next then on our? It's almost a month of vampires, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, we'll definitely kind of plan on looking at the different versions of Dracula. That's that's one of those like kind of there's such a wealth that we'll just pick out a few that we think are particularly noteworthy in different time periods, and kind of with some different classic stars like Christopher Lee. Yeah, I mean it's kind of like a mix of like where on the one hand there's so much, but the other, like, let's be selective. Reminds me of like what we did with Godzilla. That like, there was just also a ton there as well.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like, just watching, dozen more hours probably not going to add too much more to the conversation.
Well, we never know that. There's maybe something that comes out. Maybe this particular version of Dracula is actually a treatise on commodity pricing in the 1970s or something like that. You never know.
Right. And we will get to Candyman. We promise. That's definitely like one that we're both looking forward to. So it's just one of those things that I'm close to going back to theater to kind of watching that. So I mean, we'll see like kind of if that will be the case and everything. So yeah, once again, thanks for watching. I'm John Chang with Ed Edmonds, and we will see you next time.